Philosophy of religion is also not the study of the Bible, because you can't use what's written in a book to prove the truth of the book. You need outside evidence. There's also a whole area of scholarship devoted to understanding the Bible by considering the time and place in which it was written, and such study can be very helpful in understanding certain things about religion. But it doesn't help us here. Philosophy of religion is also not religious anthropology, or religious sociology, or psychological understanding about reasons for religious belief. Those are all wonderful things that you can and should study, but they are not what we're studying here. What we are doing is considering whether we can offer arguments in support of belief in God's existence. And a long time ago there was a man who argued that God's existence is provable. 11th century French monk Anselm of Canterbury. He offered a deductive argument for the existence of God based on what he understood to be the nature of God's being, or the definition of God. Because the study of being is called ontology, his argument and others like it are called ontological arguments. Now, what do you think God is like? Long, flowing white beard, robe to match, nice guy, hard to reach on the phone. Well, Anselm aimed a little bit higher. In fact, he thought God is, by definition, the best possible thing we can imagine. The best thing. Just try to think of the coolest, awesomest, most amazing and wonderful thing you can imagine, and whatever you're thinking of, Anselm said that God is better. He's just the best. In Anselm's words, God is that than which no greater can be conceived. So what does that mean? Well, it means that God must exist, according to Anselm. After all, he pointed out there are just two ways in which something can exist. Something can exist only in our minds and be strictly imaginary, like Santa or unicorns, or it can exist in our minds but also in reality, like pizza and horses. Something that we can imagine, but that's also real. Anselm pointed out, and he does appear to be right about this, that any good thing would be better if it existed in reality as well as in our minds. I mean, unicorns, they're pretty great, but wouldn't they be better if they were real? Or the perfect romantic partner. Smart, funny, hot, likes the same movies and games that you do, pretty rich, would be pretty nice in your mind, but even better if they actually existed. Well, Anselm thought so too, and from there he believed he could prove God's existence. Because if we define God as the greatest thing that we can conjure up in our minds, the only thing that could possibly be greater than him would be a real version. And since we're already imagining the greatest thing possible, there can't be anything better, therefore God has to exist both in imagination and in reality. Anselm was sure that he had done it, deductively proven God's existence in a way that was immune to error. Here it is one more time, laid out as a philosophical argument. God is the greatest thing we can think of. Things can exist only in our imaginations, or they can also exist in reality. Things that exist in reality are always better than things that exist only in our imaginations. If God existed only in our imaginations, he wouldn't be the greatest thing that we can think of, because God in reality would be better. Therefore, God must exist in reality. Anselm thought this was a tidy little argument, but one of his contemporaries, a fellow French monk named Guanello, wasn't satisfied. He suggested that we could run the same line of reasoning to prove the existence of literally anything we can imagine. He came up with an argument with the exact same formal structure as Anselm's to prove that a mythical lost island exists. He proposed the best island I can imagine is one where I can swim and relax on a tropical beach and ski down snow-covered mountains all in one afternoon. I can imagine it, so it must exist. Otherwise, it wouldn't be the best island. There would be one better, and that one would have to be real. Basically, Guanello said, you could make the same kind of argument to prove the existence of whatever you most wanted, but it wouldn't make it real. Anselm responded to Guanello's criticism by saying that he'd missed the point, that the argument only works for necessary beings, of which there is only one, God. Folks, what we have right here is a classic example of the fallacy known as begging the question. A fallacy is a flaw in reasoning, something that weakens or destroys an argument, and when you beg the question, you assume the very thing you're trying to prove with your argument. By adding this idea of a necessary being to his definition of God, Anselm makes God's existence a part of the definition of God. A necessary being is one that must exist, so Anselm's response assumed the very point of contention to be true, that God exists. Other philosophers since Anselm have tried to save his argument by tweaking it in various ways, and dissenters have continued trying to deflate them. One of the most famous objections came hundreds of years after Anselm's time from the 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant. Kant offered the point that, as he put it, existence is not a predicate. A predicate is just something that's said of another object, and Kant thought Anselm's mistake was in thinking that existence is something that can be predicated upon a thing or used as a defining characteristic. For example, if a triangle exists, it necessarily has three sides, but it could be that no triangle exists at all because the idea of existence isn't part of how we define a triangle. Likewise, Kant would say, if God exists, then he must be the greatest being that we can imagine, but that does not mean that he does exist. Predicates add to the essence essence of their subjects. Kant explained, but they can't be used to prove their existence. British philosopher John Wisdom came up with a thought exercise that sounds a lot like a debate over an ontological argument. It's called The Parable of the Invisible Gardener, which brings us to this week's Flash Philosophy. Let's go to the thought bubble. Person A and Person B return to a garden after a long absence and notice that a few of its plants are still thriving. Person A says a gardener must have been tending the garden while they were gone. Person B doubts this is true, so they agree to wait and see if a gardener shows up. After some time passes, they see no one, so Person A says the gardener must be invisible. So they put up traps and bring in bloodhounds to catch him. When no one is found, Person A says the gardener must be intangible as well as unsmellable, to which B replies, what's the difference between an invisible, intangible, unsmellable, entirely undetectable gardener and no gardener at all? Thanks, Thought Bubble. Can you guess who A and B are really talking about? To give you a sense of how long this back and forth has been going on among philosophers, trying to either prove or disprove the existence of God, John Wisdom came up with this parable in 1944, nearly 1,000 years after Anselm and Guanilo. Today, we introduced a new area of philosophy, philosophy of religion, and we learned about Anselm's argument for God's existence, while also considering objections to that argument. An important point to note here is that both Guanilo and Kant agreed with Anselm's conclusion. They also believed in God's existence. They just thought Anselm's argument didn't prove it. So remember, you can think an argument fails even if you accept the conclusion. When this happens, you should look for a better argument in favor of your conclusion. This is exactly what Thomas Aquinas did, and we'll consider him next time. This episode is brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace helps to create websites, blogs, or online stores for you and your ideas.
Oh, you have better back.
Yeah.
Going backward.
Yep. I don't see him here. Okay, shall we try this one?
Yeah.
This is not...
When is Descartes born? 16th century?
16th century.
Oh.
17th century, I think. Between 1600 and 1700.
Also, this is Descartes.
We saw this one. We saw this one. Okay. This might be a little bit more difficult than Crash Course 1, but let's give it a go.
Both difficult anyway. How about this one? What this one? No Descartes? No, not Descartes.
No. Let's look at this one. See if we can cut it.
René Descartes, French philosopher and Captain Hook lookalike. He's most famous for I think, therefore I am, but in the same book as his famous cogito argument, you will also find his original attempt to prove the existence of God, and it is this argument that we are looking at today. For those of you following along with your copy of Descartes at home, you will find it in Meditation 3, and you may already know it as the trademark argument. Descartes' mission in the Meditations was to doubt absolutely everything he could, the existence of his own body, of God, of the external world, everything. Anything that remained that he could not doubt after he'd done that, he thought would be certain knowledge. So for the moment, he isn't saying that he believes in an external physical world, which he calls formal reality. He's just examining what ideas of it he finds in his head, in representational reality. Now remember that distinction because it's going to be important. Descartes finds that he has ideas of three different sorts of things, each more real than the last. At the bottom of the scale you've got modes, or accidents, we would call them properties, which depend for their existence on finite substance. And at the top of the scale you've got the most real thing, the ens realissimum, infinite substance. So, for example, brownness is a property, but it depends for its existence on the finite substance of the table. And if you don't have the table or some finite substance there, you're not just going to get brownness, the property, floating around, not even attached to anything. And infinite substance, the ens realissimum, is God, eternal, everlasting, and omnipotent. Now remember, this isn't necessarily what formal reality is like? This is just representational reality. For now. Descartes also has this idea, which he says he cannot doubt, that a cause must have at least as much reality as its effect. So, finite substance can cause a property to exist, but the other way around doesn't work. Finite substance can cause finite substance to exist, but it can't cause infinite substance to exist. Why not? Well, Descartes thinks that if something has a property, the thing that caused it to exist must also have that property. Otherwise, we've got properties just springing into existence out of nowhere. So, for instance, if something is hot, it must be because it was heated by something else that is also hot. Or if the bridge is strong, it must be because the iron it is made of is strong, and so on. And this, he says, is true whether we're considering formal reality or representational reality. If he has an idea of finite substance, it must have been caused by something at least as real as finite substance. Descartes himself is finite substance, but he has this idea of infinite substance, God. According to what he's said so far, there's no way he could have thought of that idea on his own. So he concludes that God itself must therefore exist and have planted the idea of itself in Descartes' mind from birth, like a creator signing its creation with a trademark. Otherwise, there's just no way he could have even thought of it. There are two key principles at play in this argument.
Okay. Stop. So what he... So he's talking about attributes, formal existence, finite existence, and infinite existence. So what he has proved with, I think therefore I am, is formal existence. He exists. Then he goes about to prove that God exists because he could only fathom the existence of God if God himself had not planted it into his thoughts. Huh.
What is it?
That's his reasoning. So he goes very quickly all of a sudden. Let's go back a little bit. So you understand the hierarchy, right? So attributes, Brown, something, but Brown implies that there is a finite object. So something needs to be brown. Brown doesn't exist by itself. It only exists in the matter of coffee. Right? So, and then there is an infinite existence. So that's basically a meta-existence. God, in this case. So what Descartes observed was that he could prove the second level, the finite existence of himself, because he had thoughts. I think therefore I am. That means that my existence can be proved in a philosophical matter. But then he goes out to prove that God exists, because he would not be capable of having the ideas of God if God did not planted it there himself. But that's very strange that he come to that conclusion, because I can already see that according to the same line of argumentation, it could have been the evil genius who have put that idea into his mind. That's a very... He cannot prove that it was God. It could have been the evil genius that put the idea of God into his mind. I think the only way that this could work if he believes that God is infinitely good, but that is a premise that he cannot hold. So he believes something is infinitely good, and therefore that it could not have been the evil genius who put it into his mind, because if it's infinitely good, there is nothing evil about it, so it must have been God, and therefore God exists. That's his claim. Otherwise it would not have existed into his mind. It was the supernatural being who put that into his mind. I don't know. I think there's a flaw in the reason. But let's look further and try to see if we can understand it.
According to what he said so far, there's no way he could have thought of that idea on his own. So he concludes that God itself must therefore exist and have planted the idea of itself in Descartes' mind from birth, like a creator signing its creation with a trademark.
Oh, okay. Takai-san, are you still there? Can you catch up, or maybe it's good to review this one more time?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Let's try to review this one more time from the beginning, because this is he goes fast, and I'm not so used to listening to philosophy, so I'm not used to it at all. So let's try to see if we can understand it.
Think therefore I am. But in the same book as his famous cogito argument, you will also find his original attempt to prove the existence of God, and it is this argument that we are looking at today. For those of you following along with your copy of Descartes at home, you will find it in Meditation 3, and you may already know it as the trademark argument. Descartes' mission in the Meditations was to doubt absolutely everything he could, the existence of his own body, of God, of the external world, everything. Anything that remained that he could not doubt after he'd done that, he thought would be certain knowledge. So for the moment, he isn't saying that he believes in an external physical world, which he calls formal reality. He's just examining what ideas of it he finds in his head, in representational reality. Now remember that distinction, because it's going to be important. Descartes finds that he has ideas of three different sorts of things, each more real than the last. At the bottom of the scale, you've got modes, or accidents, we would call them properties, which depend for their existence on finite substance. And at the top of the scale, you've got the most real thing, the ens realissimum, infinite substance. So, for example, brownness is a property, but it depends for its existence on the finite substance of the table. And if you don't have the table or some finite substance there, you're not just going to get brownness, the property, floating around, not even attached to anything. And infinite substance, the ens realissimum, is God, eternal, everlasting, and omnipotent.
So, instead of brownness, I think we can say thoughts. So that is a property. Because it has thoughts, it must have substance. That's his argument. Descartes, right? I think, therefore I am, is the thoughts are the property. The property belongs to the finite substance that is me. I think, therefore I am.
Now remember, this isn't necessarily what formal reality is like. This is just representational reality. For now.
Representational reality means that it is an abstract thought. It's not through empirical observation, but it is through deduction, an abstract ideas. It's an idea, not an empirical observation. Abstract reality.
Descartes also has this idea, which he says he cannot doubt, that a cause must have at least as much reality as its effect. So, find...
Cause was at least... okay. So the cause takes priority over the effect. So the reality of the cause is bigger than the reality of the effect.
substance can cause a property to exist, but the other way around doesn't work. Finite substance can cause finite substance to exist, but it can't cause infinite substance to exist. Why not? Well, Descartes thinks that if something has a property, the thing that caused it to exist must also have that property. Otherwise, we've got properties just springing into existence out of nowhere. So, for instance, if something is hot, it must be because it was heated by something else that is also hot. Or if the bridge is strong, it must be because the iron it is made of is strong, and so on. And this, he says, is true whether we're considering formal reality or representational reality. If he has an idea of finite substance, it must have been caused by something at least as real as finite substance. Descartes himself is finite substance.
So the finite, so if something is caused by, so basically the properties here, the thoughts are more real than the existence, the proof of the existence. So the thoughts are actually more real than the existence. So
Thought is more real than existence.
right. The cause and the effect. So the cause is the thoughts. The effect is I exist. So that means that basically God is the infinite substance, but the fact that the finite substance exists is stronger than the...
God is a kind of thought.
Yes. Yeah.
He has this idea of infinite substance, God. According to what he's said so far, there's no way he could have thought of that idea on his own. So he concludes that God itself must therefore exist and have planned...
God has no idea. There's no way. So I have thoughts, therefore I exist. So there's I exist, therefore God exists. There's no way he could have thought that. Why? Why? Do you understand it?
Yeah, I understand what he said, but I don't understand why. Why thought is more realistic than real existence?
Well, that I get.
That's the reason God exists. Why?
Well, okay, so that's where I have difficulty too. The first step I understand. The fact that you have thoughts prove that you exist, but the strength of the thoughts, the realness.
Okay, I understand like this. I started to write book since last February. All the way around, okay. God told me you should write a book. So God exists. Okay, normal people cannot write a book every once, one book every month. And God ordered me to write a book. In my whole my life, never happened in my like that book, right? All my life never happened like that, and I didn't have a skill for writing book. God ordered me last February, so God exists, right?
But that is different. That's actually going back
same.
to no.
Thought is
that's going back to the same
reality.
That's going back to the same video as the last one. That is a what you are giving is a it's not a philosophical explanation, but it's a
same.
no, it's a different one. It's how did you say it?
Nobody explained. You have talent or you have skill? No. Nothing.
So, but that's the same. Like you walk into, like for example, let's say you walk into. I remember I was driving my motorcycle, and I was driving and driving. I was sweaty. I was hungry. I was thirsty, and it was scorching hot. And I drove up this hill, and then all of a sudden, I could see the entire Masai Mara with the mountains around it, with the animals in it, I saw a cloud opening up, and the sunbeam hit. So it just came down on Masai Mara, and in the distance I saw a rainbow. It was so perfect. It's what you would imagine heaven would be, and then even better, right? It was even beyond my imagination. So I could say at that moment God exists, but that's not true.
Just one scene.
It's a scene, but basically, it could still not be real. It could still be my imagination.
Currently, I wake up, I sit on my desk and write novel every day. I don't have any resistance. I'm willing to do that. Why?
But is your novel real?
No.
Can we prove that?
No.
Philosophically, ne?
No, he doesn't go anywhere. I want to write a book every day. Why? Because of God. For 68 years, it never happened like that.
But that is a...
Why? No
a
reason.
religious argument. That's not a philosophical argument.
No reason. So, but I want to make sure what he said.
Okay. Let's continue, because I'm completely lost, because he could not have believed this. I don't understand the jump when he goes from he could not have believed, he could not have had fathomed the idea of God if God himself did not exist. So basically what he's saying, so basically the same argument, like there are thoughts, therefore I am. So he has thoughts about a higher being, therefore the higher being exists. That's the argument. Like here, that's also for you. So basically, there's properties, there's finite substance and infinite substance. So his first statement was, I think, therefore I am. That is based on the property that he thinks, and therefore he concludes that finite substance, he himself, exists. Right? So now he sees that there is this idea of God exists in him. That there is a stronger cause and effect. That means that basically that that must have been put into his mind by God himself. Therefore God exists. So if finite substance, if he can prove that he exists by his thoughts, then his thoughts about God prove that God exists. I think that's briefly what his statement is about. Because we can prove that he exists, therefore his thoughts of God could have only been put there by God himself. Let's continue.
The idea of itself in Descartes' mind from birth, like a creator signing its creation with a trademark. Otherwise, there's just no way he could have even thought of it. There are two key principles at play in this argument. The first is this idea that some things are more real than others, the levels of reality principle. And the second is this idea that causes must be at least as real as their effects, the causal adequacy principle. And unfortunately for Descartes, both of them are pretty much bollocks. Now, kudos to Descartes, he did actually circulate copies of the Meditations and ask people to critique it so that he could reply to their criticisms, which is as close to leaving the comments section on as he could possibly have done in those days. And in some editions of the book, you'll find the criticisms and his replies to them in the back. Unfortunately, that also means his ideas kind of got put through the mangle a little bit. First off, the causal adequacy principle, well, we know that's not true. Something doesn't need to have the same properties as the thing it causes to exist. Jim Cottingham, who is a modern-day Descartes commentator, gives the example of helium, which has quite different properties from the hydrogen that is fused to make it, or a cake, which might have quite different properties from the ingredients that go into it. One of the contemporary examples that Descartes received was from mathematician and music theorist Marin Mersenne, who said that animals and plants are alive, but they are kept alive by the actions of the sun and the rain, which are not alive. Interestingly, Descartes tried to get around that counterexample by saying that animals aren't actually alive. They're just sort of organic robots, automatons with no feeling or sensation, a point that he sadly tried to prove by dissecting living dogs without anaesthetic. Secondly, the levels of reality principle, which received its most damning criticism from Thomas Hobbes himself in one of my favourite lines of philosophy that has stayed with me since I first read the Meditations as a kid. Does reality admit of more or less? Descartes says that finite substance is more real than properties, and infinite substance is more real than finite substance, but what does more real mean? Things don't exist more or less on a sliding scale. Either something exists or it doesn't. So, sadly for Descartes, his trademark argument is more or less consigned to the history of philosophy now. But he's still got the cogito going for him. That was still pretty important, and it just goes to show you can't win them all. But what do you guys think of Descartes' trademark argument? Do you buy it? Next time we could either do should we keep nuclear weapons, or we could do the ethics of suicide prevention. For more philosophical videos every Friday, please subscribe. Before we do the comments from before Christmas, some quick items of housekeeping.
Please?
So basically, this is philosophy. Now I recognize this is the same as economics. The discussion here is not focused on the way that he derived the conclusions. The discussion is focused on the premise. The premise that he actually says, okay, cause and effect are, and hierarchy, the levels of reality, they are nonsense. There is no such thing as a level of reality. Something is not more real than other things. It either exists or it doesn't exist. There is no hierarchy there. Another thing is cause and effect. The effect is stronger, is more real than the cause. The cake is not more real than the substances it is made of. So a cake is just as real as the eggs and the milk and the flour that it consists of, but it's a different substance. So basically, the argument that he's using to prove that God exists does not survive. So what? So then the question is, why is Descartes so important? I don't think that question is being answered. Also, Hank, in his video from Squarespace, the philosophy videos, he also says there are serious flaws in his reasoning. So then the question remains, why is he so important?
So,
this video doesn't answer that, because actually the philosophical justification of his conclusion seems to be weak, if not just wrong.
okay, just one thing I understand. Thought is more real than reality. He said, right?
No, actually, now in his conclusion he says it the other way around. That's strange. He says it the other way around.
Dogs without anaesthetic. Secondly, the levels of reality principle, which received its most damning criticism from Thomas Hobbes himself in one of my favourite lines of philosophy that has stayed with me since I first read the Meditations as a kid. Does reality admit of more or less? Descartes says that finite substance is more real than properties, and infinite substance is more real than finite substance, but what does more real mean? Things
so
don't
he says
exist.
actually the other way around. So infinite existence is more real than finite substance. Infinite substance is more real than finite substance, and finite substance is more real than properties. So basically, Hobbes says that's nonsense. Reality does not allow for gradation. It either exists or it doesn't exist. There is no gray in reality. It's black or white. It exists or it doesn't exist. There is no gray in reality. Which I actually would even... I think actually reality is very subjective. So there's a lot of gray in reality. Connor?
I want to, maybe he said reality, just Descartes said reality has many grays.
Yes.
So I want to know that what he's talking about. Spiritual and reality, what kind of relationship is there?
So there are properties, my thoughts. Then there is the finite substance that is me as I exist, and then there's the infinite substance which is God. So the highest reality is God. Then the second highest is me, and then the third is my thoughts. That's less real.
But why he's talking about infinite substance?
So basically, he proves by going from less real to more real. So he proves his existence by his thoughts. That is, he proves his finite substance through the property of his thoughts. But at the same time, he says that the reality of his existence is actually higher than his properties. So, if it sings like a bird and flies like a bird, it must be a bird. But the bird has a higher level of reality than the fact that it sings or it flies. Mm-hmm. That's his line of reasoning.
What is me?
So, if it sings like a bird and flies like a bird, it must be a bird. So the properties are singing and flying. So we conclude that it sings and it flies, therefore it must be a bird. The bird is the finite substance. Mm. But the bird is more real than the fact that it sings and it flies, according to the level of reality of Descartes. That's his argument.
That's to understand.
Oh, well, actually, it's widely criticized, and most people don't understand nor agree. So the proof of God doesn't seem to be what made Descartes an influential philosopher. The proof that he exists seems to be more fundamental.
Let's have a look another one.
Okay. Taka-san, are you still patient?
Yeah, he can, but still I don't understand. He tries to focus on what the true meaning is.
Oh.
Descartes.
Yes. Shimeru. Oh man. You got a lot of spam on us, huh?
Oh, yeah?
Mm.
I watched many naked women.
だから。 This one.
What's the Descartes meditation?
God.
Meditation. No, meditation.
Oh.
Huh? Say?
Philosophy classroom.
How about this one?
You want to try it?
Oh, how about this one? This was very long.
Huh.
He did something meditation.
Hmm.
Does he?
Yeah, apparently. The Kohito.
What is meditation?
That's thinking.
He is something like he meditation. How about this one?
Second meditation.
What is my second meditation? They had first meditation, right?
Yeah.
Just have a look.
10 key points. Damn. So he derives to the conclusion, I think therefore I am.
Nothing new, huh?
Nothing new. Let's try something else. We saw this one, no? Oh, yeah, we saw this one. Maybe. This one or this one?
Not that one, not the card.
No. I can't find it. I can't find it. The ontological. I think the ever God exists, that is...
What are you doing? Searching?
So... So I think this one is probably our best bet. This one or this one. No. Let's have a look at this one.
Descartes' ontological argument is discussed in the fifth meditation. The motivation for it is this. You will remember that Descartes said, I can be certain that I exist, but I can't be certain that there's a world outside me. So he needed a bridge to get him from his own experience to something external to his mind. What could that bridge be? Well, he thought that it would have to be a good God. Not just a God, but a good one. Good so that he wouldn't want to deceive us or make us think mistaken things about the world outside us, just so long as we use our faculties, our sense perception and our reason responsibly. So he gave two arguments for the existence of God. The argument about the very concept of God in meditation 3, and then in the fifth meditation, the ontological argument. Now, you may be familiar with St. Anselm's version of the argument back in medieval times, where St. Anselm says, there is something in the universe which is the greatest thing there is. But Descartes tweaked it somewhat. He said, there is something in the universe which is the most perfect thing there is. And a most perfect thing that exists is more perfect than one that doesn't exist. And therefore, the most perfect thing exists. Now, the logic of this argument is meant to be, and you can prove the existence of God on the basis of reason alone. Just by thinking of the very concept of the deity, you get your proof for the existence of the deity. Well, alas, there are many things wrong with the argument. One thing, of course, is that the concept of a perfection is very vague. Alas, we all know what it is to be imperfect. What do we mean by perfections? Well, you could say, perhaps, being omniscient and omnipotent and entirely benevolent. Maybe that's what was meant. All right. Then, a much more important problem with the argument is the idea that existence is a property of things. So if I say, for example, this jacket I'm wearing is blue, belongs to me, it exists, it has several pockets, you might say, hang on a second, it's all right to say that its properties are that it's blue and that it has pockets that belongs to you, but how can existence be just one of those properties? I might dye this jacket and make it a different colour, and then it wouldn't have the property of blueness. But could I have a non-existent jacket which was blue and had pockets and so on? No. So existence cannot be one among the properties of something. It must be presupposed to the thing. And this is the criticism that Immanuel Kant levelled against the ontological argument. He said existence is not a property, therefore it is a presupposition, therefore the argument won't go through. But there is another reason too. Think of this. You could use the same style of argument to prove that the devil cannot exist. There it goes. There is a being in the universe which is the least perfect being there is. A least perfect being which doesn't exist is even less perfect than one that does. Therefore, the least perfect being doesn't exist. And you can see that this makes a nonsense of the logic of the argument. There are other problems with the argument, but these are among the most serious.
Did you get it? But indeed, he didn't explain it, but I already concluded that before.
The motivation
that it presupposes that God is an infinitely good thing or good something. So it doesn't try to deceive us. So it precludes deception. And if it is indeed infinitely good, then what would be better than infinitely good is that it's not just a concept, but it would actually exist. Therefore, God is the best that we can imagine, and even better because it exists. It's the best thing that exists, but it presupposes that God is good, necessarily good.
What is his message?
His message is that his the reasoning that Descartes follows is flawed.
Huh?
His message is that it's actually flawed. What he explains,
So?
flawed. F-L-A-W-E-D, flawed.
No.
It's wrong.
Huh?
It's wrong. So, he says that the best, Descartes says that existence cannot be a property. It either is or is not. So, and also is that if existence, if we can think of something infinitely good, then the only thing that it could be better. So it's the best thing. God is the best thing that you can imagine. The best thing that you can imagine is the best thing that you can imagine, but it can only be better if it exists. Therefore, God must exist because it's the best thing.
Another.
Okay.
Something else.
This one.
René Descartes is another scholar who offers a version of the ontological argument for the existence of God. Again, he is someone who takes a rationalist perspective and is claiming that reason can support faith. There are two concepts within Descartes' philosophy which can relate to this argument. These are the theory of innate ideas and the belief in clear and distinct perception. Descartes claimed that within us all we have certain concepts or ideas that we have not developed for ourselves, but instead they exist within our minds as intrinsic to us. In addition, he claimed that where it is possible to perceive of an idea clearly and distinctly, it must really have those qualities that I perceive.
Already I lost. So he believes that some meta ideas are you are born with. They are part of your human existence. But the other one, the idea of innate, built-in ideas.
Yes, and the belief in clear and distinct perception. Descartes claimed that within us all we have certain concepts or ideas that we have not developed for ourselves, but instead they exist within our minds as intrinsic to us. In addition, he claimed that where it is possible to perceive of an idea clearly and distinctly, it must really have those qualities that I perceive. I have an idea that I perceive clearly and distinctly of God. Descartes' argument does not depend on a random definition of God, but rather on an innate idea whose content is granted or assumed. Descartes used reasoning before empirical evidence to produce his argument. He felt that the senses were not to be trusted when attempting to understand truth and reality. He began by taking all things off the table of knowledge and starting from scratch. He felt from the outset the one thing he could know was that he exists on the basis that he was thinking. Whilst he could demonstrate his own existence, Descartes realised that he couldn't demonstrate the existence of others rationally. He was aware of the properties of a triangle, and even if triangles had never existed, they would still have the distinct characteristics of 3 sides and 3 angles. He has not come to know the nature of triangles through the senses, as the senses would not derive the triangle's properties as clearly and distinctly as he does in his mind. Hence, such mathematical principles are knowable rationally. As a general principle, when we consider an idea, what we perceive clearly and distinctly as belonging to it really does belong to it. So by definition, if we conceive of a triangle, it really does have 3 angles as part of the concept. So, Descartes felt that he could be sure of his own existence and the existence of the principles of mathematics. From here, he went on to demonstrate that we can be sure of the existence of God.
Well, through mathematics.
Here, Descartes is saying that I possess a clear and distinct understanding of God, who possesses certain characteristics, one of which is existence. When I perceive of this God as supremely perfect, the concept comes innately from within my mind and really does possess the characteristics that I perceive it has. This God possesses the predicate of existence because I clearly perceive that he does. If we break this argument down, we can split it into 2 parts. Firstly, I conceive clearly and distinctly that necessary existence belongs to the essence of God. Therefore, existence really does belong to the essence of God. His argument does not depend on an arbitrary definition of God, but rather on an innate idea, whose content is granted or assumed. God's existence is the logical conclusion drawn from the fact that necessary existence is contained in the clear and distinct idea of a supremely perfect being.
Damn. It's so hard.
Change
So it can only be perfect if it exists. It can only be perfect if it exists. If it doesn't exist, it's not perfect, because it would be more perfect if it would exist. So therefore God, since it is by definition perfect, God must exist.
Say again? I can say.
So it has the attribute that it exists, right? God, like, because God is perfect, is perfection, perfection. If God would not exist, it would be more perfect if He would exist. But if we say that God is perfect, if we believe that God is perfect, He must exist. Otherwise, He would not be perfect.
Why God's perfect?
That's the premise. God is perfect. That is what he feels and perceives as the definition of God. God, as a being, is perfect. And he can only be perfect if he exists. Oh my God.
Change the video.
No, okay. So now I finally start to understand.
More kind of elementary video. We don't have it. Why everybody so difficult to
Because I think they are trying to explain something that is unexplainable. Because there is no. How can you come up with a logical?
Why nobody can explain more easy way?
Well, because basically they are trying to make sense out of something that is insensible.
Okay, let's say why Descartes, many audience favor his idea at that age, but why those people were influenced by Descartes? What is the point? Nobody tells it. Do you know that many people influenced by Descartes at this age?
1600.
Yeah.
My idea is that probably a lot of people did not even understand Descartes, but
okay, one
conclusion
please ask him. My mental attitude and my physical is the same. She said no, but he said a lot of things. But she favor for his opinion. But why she is favor him? I simple question, you know. But everybody, like Confucius, the same. They try to explain so difficult explanation, dumb explanation. Maybe everybody don't understand well, right? Like more. Why do they don't have a more ordinary explanation for common people? I'm not a university professor.
Well, I think everybody is struggling with the fact to make God exist. So there are some very fundamental.
I tell you why everybody, so many people, is boring explanation they make.
Well, it's not boring to me. It's just it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense for me, right? Why none of those? I read the Confucius case. I read a lot of Japanese articles. They find that only one, to understand the content of what Confucius said.
Okay. Crash course, man. The crash course explains it best.
No, crash course is really this one crashed. Okay, and I like his crash course, John Green. They don't John Green, no John Green.
No, this is his brother. Hank Green. John Green does history. Hank Green does philosophy.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, I see. Do you have another one? One more, we have time.
I'm developing a headache.
You had headache. I have more, you know.
Okay, let's I think maybe this one.
Which one?
Let's have a look. What is God like?
Are you sure?
Let's.
Crash Course Philosophy is brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace. Share your passion with the world.
We've spent quite a bit of time looking at arguments for God's existence. But we haven't said much yet about this God. Like, what's he like? Is he a he? Is he like strictly Marvel superheroes, or is he more of a DC guy? Does he prefer his salsa with or without cilantro? I like corn. Who's his favorite crystal gem from Steven Universe? I guess those kinds of questions would only apply to a heavily personalized and anthropomorphic God. But the traditional picture of God, the one accepted and even assumed throughout Judeo-Christian tradition up into modern times, is what we might call an omni-God, possessing particular divine attributes, the characteristics believed to be held by God. Now let's pause for a moment to acknowledge that this discussion is of one particular God, the one who stars in Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scriptures. Of course, lots of people believe in lots of other gods, and they all have attributes of their own. We're focusing on this God because he's the one all of the philosophers we've been studying were talking about. He's the one they believed or didn't believe in. Philosophers like Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, who are themselves influenced by the writings of Plato and Aristotle, came up with a general set of divine attributes that are still widely held among today's theists. And in this view, God is omniscient, which means that he knows everything that can be known, and he's also omnipotent, or all-powerful. He's been said to be omnibenevolent, or possessing perfect goodness, and he's omnitemporal and omnipresent, meaning he exists at all places and all times times at once. Now, it's worth noting that none of these attributes is actually mentioned in the Bible, but philosophers like Aquinas reasoned that they must be the case if God is perfect, and these philosophers took it as given that he is. The problem is, a close investigation of these attributes reveals some rather tricky little puzzles. No, I take that back. They are really, really big puzzles. Can God create a rock so heavy he can't lift it? Is just one of an infinite number of unanswerable questions that can be asked about God. Like, if God is omnipotent, he has to be able to create something so heavy he can't lift it. Otherwise, his inability to create it would mean that there's at least one thing he couldn't do. But then he wouldn't be omnipotent, because if he were truly all-powerful, he'd be able to lift anything. Quandaries like this come up all the time when you consider the divine attributes. And some of the questions that arise are not only about God, but also about us. For instance, if God knows everything, then he also knows the future, right? Which makes sense if he's also omnitemporal, because that would mean that he's already in the future, and also in the past. And don't forget the present. But many theists also believe that God gave us free will. So how can we be free if God already knows what we're going to do? In that case, are we really free, or is freedom just an illusion that he created for us to make us feel like we're in control? What we're seeing here is that, at least on the surface, God's traditional divine attributes are internally inconsistent, meaning they can't all be true at the same time. And what do you do if you hold inconsistent beliefs? Well, if you're being philosophically rational, you either give some of them up, or you figure out a way to understand them that makes them consistent. This is what a theist who believes in the omni-God has to do. Let's think about the contradiction that arises from believing the following propositions. 1, God is omniscient. 2, humans have free will. Is there any way to resolve this contradiction, or do we have to surrender one of those beliefs? One possible response is to say that knowledge and causation aren't the same thing. So God might know that we're going to do something without actually causing us to do it. This actually makes sense if you think about it. Imagine a person standing on a cliff looking down at a train track that curves around a bend. From her vantage point, the onlooker can see that just on the other side of the bend, a person is stuck on the track as the train approaches. Too far away to do anything, the onlooker knows the accident will happen before it does, but the fact that she knows it will happen doesn't mean that she caused it to happen. To use a less gruesome example, if God knew you were going to eat an entire pecan pie by yourself over the course of a lonely weekend, that doesn't mean that he caused you to do it. That was all on you. But wait, if God is omniscient, then he can't be wrong, can he? Because if he was ever wrong, then there would have been something he didn't know. So if God knew you were going to eat the whole pie, then you couldn't not eat the pie, because if you decided not to at the last minute, then you would have just proven God wrong, thereby single-handedly stripping him of his divine omniscience. Good job. So the knowledge and power of God are, to say the least, philosophically perplexing. Now let's consider another question about God's personal skill set. Can God sin? If he's omnipotent, it would seem that he can, because he can do anything, but if he's omnibenevolent, or inherently good, then it would seem that he can't. This doctrine, which says that God can't sin, is known as divine impeccability. But if God is impeccable and incapable of sin, then doesn't that mean that he is not omnipotent? After all, I can sin easily. I mean, give me 5 minutes, I could probably break like 2 or 3 commandments, like the ones about coveting stuff, not the murdery ones. Still, it seems kind of weird to think that I can do something that God can't. Some people try to solve this particular puzzle by saying that sin is necessarily a failure, so therefore a perfect being can't do it. Others say that even though God might do something that would be a sin if a human did it, the idea of sin simply doesn't apply to God, perhaps because given his omnibenevolence, everything that God does is inherently good. Now, many philosophers find this solution troubling because it kind of makes God's goodness vacuous. After all, it basically means that saying God did a thing would be the same thing as saying God did a good thing, because ipso facto anything God does is good. And if that's the case, then his goodness doesn't have any real meaning. Yet another possible contradiction presents itself in the belief that the omni-God is also a personal God. Many people find it difficult to suppose that God could be omnitemporal and omniscient, yet still have a personal relationship with his creatures. It's hard to understand how God could relate to us, or feel the way we feel, if he doesn't experience time as we do. If he already knows what's going to happen, how could he ever be surprised or change his mind? And if God is omnitemporal, is it even possible that he could be moved to respond to prayers? Let's look at this idea up close in this week's Flash Philosophy. To the thought bubble. When people talk about praying for something to happen or to not happen or are otherwise making a request of God, they're making what are known as petitionary prayers. When you pray in this way, you're asking God for something, to help you pass a test or to save a loved one who's in danger or to make sure the Patriots win the game. Contemporary American philosopher Eleanor Stump argues that we have no reason to think that asking God for something would actually make a difference. She thinks about it like this: if God knows everything, including the future, which he does if he's omniscient, and if God has the power to bring about any state of affairs, which he does if he's omnipotent, and if he always wants to bring about the best state of affairs, which he does if he's omnibenevolent, then God has already decided what's going to happen in every single case, to everyone, always. So either your prayer is asking God to do something he was already going to do, in which case your prayer was kind of a waste of time, or your prayer is asking God to do something he's already decided not to do because it wasn't actually the best thing. Sorry, Patriots. And in that case, even if God would change his mind based on your prayer, you wouldn't want him to, because it would actually make things worse than they would have been if you just let God do his thing. In other words, if God knows what's best, why would you want to change his mind? Now, Stump suggests that there might be some value in the asking, even if the prayer doesn't actually change what's going to happen. Maybe you agree with her. But at this point, it should be clear just how many problems there are in the divine attributes when you think about them. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Thomas Aquinas, the thinker who's largely responsible for the traditional divine attributes we think of today, responded to these sorts of puzzles by saying that all the speculation of what God is like is just analogical predication. Basically, Aquinas said that we can't predicate or assert anything about God because he's so far beyond our understanding. When we speak of God, Aquinas said, we never really say anything that's true. Instead, we have to speak entirely in analogies because that's all we can do. So God isn't literally our Father, for example, but we can understand his role for us as being father-like because that's as close as we can get to really understanding what he is. Or think of it this way. People in South Florida might say it's cold when the temperature dips into the 50s, but in Alaska it's not cold until it's well below zero. But both of those frames of reference are more similar to each other than they are to the cold that is absolute zero, which is about negative 273 degrees Celsius. You might even say that absolute zero cold and negative 10 degree cold are not even the same thing. But we use that one word, cold, to describe them both as a kind of analogical way of talking about something that defies our complete and personal understanding. So Aquinas basically said not to worry about all of these puzzles because none of these things we say about God is more than an approximation, a little analog that our tiny little minds can come up with so that we can talk about an infinite being. Now, there are other thinkers, particularly in modern times, who point out that none of the traditional divine attributes are in the Bible anyway, so maybe God isn't an omni-God. Maybe he's more like a superhero. He can be way smarter than us, way more powerful than us, way more good than us, but still not perfect. This seems like a sacrilege to a lot of people, but some philosophers argue that it's more compatible with the God of the Bible. After all, in the Bible we see God doing very human things, like walking in the garden, getting angry, being surprised, and changing his mind. So it could be possible that God actually does hate cilantro or is a big fan of amethyst. That's the kind of stuff that we, as philosophers, get to ponder kindly and thoughtfully in the comments. Today, we learned about the traditional divine attributes omnipotence, omniscience, omnitemporality, and omnibenevolence, and the puzzles that they create for our understanding of God. We also explored some possible solutions to those puzzles, from Aquinas' ideas of analogical predication to the work of Eleanor Stump. This episode is brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace helps to create websites, blogs, or online stores for you and your ideas. Websites look professionally
Does
designed,
not
regardless
bring
of
us
skill
closer
level, no
to
coding required.
Descartes.
No. Oh my God.
This wait. These are all of them.
You can find that good one. I don't know who he is.
Wow. Oh, let me open this one and see if we can.
Crash Course Philosophy is brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace. Share your passion with the world.
For generations, just about everybody in the United States got vaccinations, and I'm sure there will be no conversation about this in the comments. And as a result, diseases like measles were all but eradicated. But in 1998, a study published in a scientific journal linked vaccines with autism. Even though that study was later discredited, ever since then...
This is not what I'm looking for.
How about Descartes spiritual? He doesn't have spiritual?
Meet René, Crash Course. We saw this one, right?
He is not spiritual?
Cartesian skepticism. We saw that one. Empiricism. Knowledge. Popper. We saw this one. Kindness, it's not there. Intelligence, not there. What is God like? Did we see that one? Yeah.
All those is not good. We have watched many of those, but not good. Touching focus.
Okay, let's ask a different question then.
Same answer. How about this one? How about dual mind and body?
Once Descartes confirms that he has knowledge of his own existence, he's able to learn a few things about himself, like, I am a thinking thing, and I am thinking these things, I have these thoughts in my mind, and so on. But he needs to do a lot more than this if he's going to build on this foundation a new structure of knowledge. And this is his goal, so he must keep going, and he must find a really good way of demonstrating more truth, giving us more knowledge and more foundations for knowledge, and most importantly, from this knowledge of himself. And here is the first thing he does to do it. He uses this argument for the existence of God. It's sort of a modified ontological argument. Well, you could also almost call it a cosmological argument. It's sort of a hybrid cosmological ontological argument. It's based off his own idea of God. He observes there is in my thought an idea of a perfect being. And he observes every effect must have a cause which has at least as much perfection as is in the effect. So my idea of a perfect being must have for its cause a perfect being. Now I'm not perfect because I'm doubting, and I know that's not a quality consistent with perfection. So there must be something besides me that exists and is the cause of this idea of God. And it must be a perfect being. Because how else could it have as much perfection as its effect? Therefore, God exists and is a perfect being. Now, this argument has persuaded very few, if any, people to become theists. And probably it's because there's something wrong with the argument. And I think what is wrong with the argument is that the idea that a perfect being exists, or the idea of a perfect being, does not have all the perfections of its object. It's an idea of a perfect being. But the idea itself doesn't have to be perfect. The idea itself might well be an imperfect idea, and so could easily have been caused by the mind thinking of it. As far as I can tell, that seems to be the weakness in the argument. Nevertheless, Descartes seems to think the argument is pretty good. And it's important to understand he does offer other arguments for the existence of God. This is the main one, or the first one, in the Meditations on First Philosophy, or the Discourse on Method Part 4, where he's going through the method of doubt and reestablishing knowledge on a solid foundation. This is how it starts with the evidence for God. But there is more. He gives supplementary arguments. And he does give an ontological argument, a more classic ontological argument, with some modifications from Anselm. But it's an argument based on the idea of God. And it's an argument to consider on its own terms. It may not have this, the same weaknesses as this argument. Now, after establishing the existence of God using this argument, which I tend to think, and I suspect most viewers of this video will agree, is not a very good argument because of the fact that an idea does not necessarily contain all the perfections of the thing the idea is of. After all this, he uses the idea of God, he uses his knowledge that God exists to establish more knowledge. That's coming up next.
Okay. So he also criticizes the idea that, because I think, because cause needs to be stronger than effect. The fact that I think God is perfect, then perfect is the idea, and the existence stems from the fact that would make it perfect, because it's imperfect if it's just an idea. So if it's just an idea, it's not perfect. So by definition, it must exist. The perfect idea must exist.
What mean perfect idea?
So the idea of perfection, God being perfect, that presupposes that God exists. Because if God would not exist, it would not be perfect. Because God would be more perfect if it would exist. If it would exist.
There are many people saying perfect. What does it mean perfect?
Well, everybody seems to agree. All the Christians seem to agree that God is perfect. Right? So God is something, is a concept, is a being, is a whatever. That is perfect. That is perfect. But if he is perfect,
Perfect means it's sort of idea.
right? So basically, we can think of God and say God is just, God is omnipotent, God knows everything, God can determine everything in the universe. That God is good, is infinitely good. So these are all concept attributes that we could assign to God, right? But if those are just ideas, then he's not perfect, because he would be even more perfect if he actually exists. So God is perfect, therefore God exists. Otherwise he would not be perfect by definition.
This is like skipping logic.
So,
Oh my God.
so Descartes' argument. Okay, so then the question is, why did Descartes get so much credit as a philosopher?
Yeah. Why
I think-
so much credit?
I think the point is probably that his first argument, I think, therefore I am, seemed to be an irrefutable truth and kind of easily understood by people. His second argument seemed to be an argument that everybody wanted to hear. It fed into a widespread belief that God must exist, and there was not a better explanation or better philosophical justification than the one given by Descartes. This is from the guy who actually came up with the philosophical wisdom that he exists. Now, then he comes with a message that therefore God exists. That is what everybody wants to believe, right? Because God is, that is what everybody hears every day. Education is based on that. Entire life is based on the concept of that God is perfect. People go to church to hear that. It is the only idea that exists in people. Christianity is the basis of education, is the basis of everything. It starts with everything. So you cannot just go around and say, well, God doesn't exist. That is not a good idea. So I believe that the philosophical justification that God exists is not the value of that.
Descartes said God exists.
God exists. If he wouldn't exist, he wouldn't be perfect. And given that God is perfect, that is a premise. That is his. He claims that is absolutely true. So that is not a devil. That is not a deviant genius. That is God exists. So that is a given. He doesn't want to challenge the fact that God is perfect. But given that premise, God must exist. Otherwise, there would be a better version of God possible, thinkable. So he must exist. Otherwise, he could never be perfect. It's a wordplay.
But his saying example is not persuasive for me.
No, I don't think that actually. But how can you justify the
For
existence
example,
of God?
just I told you, like since last February I've started to write a novel because of I have suddenly changed. Somebody ordered me to write book. Maybe God exists. Kind of, his example, he's speaking out something like that. Understandable.
But it could be God. It could be Allah. It could be Buddha. It could be
Buddha and Shinto and exist like kind of relatives. But
okay.
Descartes says something. No.
No. He doesn't touch that. He doesn't touch that. He just says, okay, God is perfect. That's his premise. So God is perfect.
How he could
Therefore he
persuade
exists.
audience, ordinary people? Unbelievable. How
Well, I think
he's
people heard the message, but they
what he's saying
didn't
so
read the book.
attractive for common people. No, just ordinary people.
Well, I don't think there were that many people who could actually read.
Yeah, many just influenced many. How come? Many.
When I see the videos that are available on God, on God and Descartes, I only see
Many
skepticism. But influence them as a philosopher. But that is basically
This is influence philosopher and
yeah.
this
But,
is
also, but I think
give the influence.
But actually, what I would say is not. He's maybe not his conclusion
For
about
example, Noam Chomsky.
Noam Chomsky. Okay. So Noam Chomsky probably influenced Descartes. No. He was influenced by Descartes. But
Yeah.
I think the reason.
Like John Locke,
Right.
Thomas Hobbes.
Right. So, but Thomas Hobbes rejects the idea of the proof. Thomas Hobbes does not agree with the
Also
proof.
Kant.
Immanuel Kant, yeah, definitely. The Immanuel Kant also concludes that God exists, but Nietzsche doesn't. So Nietzsche is also in my Nietzsche. God is dead.
John Locke. Pascal.
So let's tick. I'm going to skip forward in today because we are now in the topic of religion, and I think we Nietzsche is now in place.
It doesn't matter. Just we try to more clearly understand what Descartes is more important.
Then Nietzsche?
No, Descartes.
Okay.
You're going to study Nietzsche?
Well, the on the theme of God and the existence of God.
Well, my concern is why Descartes said God is exist.
Why he says? Oh, well, basically, based on the premise that he held, that God is perfect.
Okay, my guess is mental, spiritual, in the heart, and physical existence. If he said physical mind and existence is different, spiritual existence and physical existence is different from mental spirit. So mental spirit is more important than physical existence. If he said, I understand.
But he doesn't say that.
So, why? So his God is existence.
He doesn't say that. He doesn't. Well, basically, his premise, like he justified doubts of everything, but he does not allow doubt of God because, per definition, he says God is perfect.
This is what I don't understand.
The evil, not an evil genius. So God is not an evil genius. So if God is an evil genius, then he would have actually, if there is an evil genius that would give us the image of God, which I could actually imagine, because God and religion has been the source of many wars throughout history, and many conflicts throughout history, and many divisions throughout history. So if God and the existence of multiple gods are actually not perfection, then the theory of Descartes dies. So the only way that we can support this theory is if we accept the fact that God is perfect. But who's God? Is it Allah? Is it God? Is it Buddha? Is it? I don't know.
This is what I'm not Christianity, so I don't understand.
Well, I would argue that maybe God is not perfect. Maybe it is actually supports his evil genius theory. Maybe religion has been given to us to deceive the people. This is what Marx argues.
I know the evil exists. People is 1 out of 1 million people. One is evil. Exists. Okay, this is evil. Actually, human-like, but this person is evil. But I don't recognize who's God. God exists. I can't understand. Spiritually, I understand.
Okay, well, you can say, okay, God, you cannot understand God exists, but on the other hand, if we would...
But this is, you're talking about, Descartes says, not spiritual, right?
We're talking about philosophical, eh? We're talking about philosophical, not about a religion, about a form of... What's that?
Spiritual?
Yeah, a belief. It doesn't question the belief. It doesn't question what is the better God. Basically, it asks the question of existence. So, does God exist? So, at first he asks himself, do I exist? Yes, he concludes, I exist. And since God, as an idea, as a concept, is perfection, God is perfect, therefore God must exist, because if he would not exist, he would not be perfect.
This is logical jumping. Perfect is, but what does it mean perfect is God existence connected to?
Well, if God would not exist, he would be imperfect, therefore God must exist. If non-existence means imperfection, then by definition God must exist. That's the philosophical argument.
Why at that time he was so famous, and his name was remained in history. Any other philosopher, they have something, very heavy product. He just existing. But so far, I don't study Descartes in my past. But so far, I don't think he's so much, heavy.
Well, basically, he is
heritage.
He is the strongest example of an epistemological philosopher, because he doubts everything. So he doesn't take anything at face value in order to find the ultimate truth. Finding the truth, the love of truth, the true meaning of philosophy. There doesn't come any philosopher to mind who is more strict and more concise into finding the truth than Descartes. Because if we go to the empirical philosophers, we can only find induction, right? Because through observation we can see that the political figures on the marketplace do not always win the argument because of the value of their argumentation, whether they're right or wrong. Other arguments take place. So a philosopher like Aristotle, he observes that, and he tries to give us advice and tries to give us help to build better argumentation so that we can actually win the argument. That is very weak if we compare it to the very strict and logical reasoning that Descartes applies to find the truth. Descartes has nothing more in his head than simply some ideas, and based on that, he builds a very rigorous world that does not need empirical verification. That he tries to find the ultimate truth, and therefore he's the ultimate philosopher.
For example, Toyota Kanban system, right? And the same question he made, why? Then he established Kanban system, right? And this is a remarkable innovation in the history. So sort of Toyota Kanban system the same. They try
Kanban
to
system.
count why and why and why. This is finally they find out new invention, right? So Descartes, if you talking about try to skeptical for everything, and finally, what he found it.
So what he found is actually, if you can be skeptical about everything, you can doubt anything.
Then finally,
But finally, he found that if you doubt anything, that you can know that you exist, because
So
you know
my
that
question
doubts
is-
exist in you,
Why?
you, only in you, not in others. But you can be sure that you exist because you doubt.
okay, this is everybody saying that. I've read this one before. But always I was so skeptical. How come so why I am? This one existence is impact for everybody. That's okay. If you are, you yourself existence. So what?
That's a big question.
No,
It's a big. Ego is I think probably the thing that bothers people most. People are, well, maybe not in Japan, but in the rest of the world, we are very self-centered and preoccupied with ourselves and definitely with our existence. Now there comes along this philosopher who actually proves that I exist and gives to be or not to be. That's the question Shakespeare asked. So the question of existence and whether I actually exist is a very big one, and he is the first one to give a convincing answer to that question. So that's not small.
So they have not impact by his what he said.
Well, also you need to realize that, for example, one of his people from his inner circle.
Okay, this is Westerners, Oriental people, whoever. It's kind of human being, analyze their mental attitude and whatever, everything, spiritual, whatever. They have thousand years history. A lot of people thinking about who are they.
Right.
This is history.
Right.
Instead of chemical.
Right, that's empirical. That's
yeah.
basically, yeah.
Many people thinking for 1,000 years.
Right.
And what Descartes contributed for the so kind of history. This is what my concern is.
But it's not the history. It's not based on empirical. Basically, he wants to know what he's certain of, because, like was said in one of the videos we saw before, that how can we be certain that the history?
Well,
that
for example,
observe
one
is
example
really
is 2,500 years ago. Okay, and Confucius wrote a book. At that time, they don't have word of heart. Not word of heart. They
Right.
don't have heart. Did not exist.
Right.
Later on, they'll find out. Sort of thing. And Confucius, that era is they just only have benevolence and propriety. Just only two words. Any other word they don't exist. Okay. Then gradually they find a lot of concept of the thinking approach. So all the way history, many philosophers in the history, and they have some like Plato, Aristotle, Socrates. They have asset of the impressive people, even though current people have very good impact on them, right? So my simple question is, he is also a very famous person, right?
Right.
But I don't understand today in discussion what is so much impressive, even if I'm not Christianity, okay? Even if I don't have...
Yeah, but his contribution to the existence of God is much less important and less known and much more doubted and criticized than his conclusion about his existence. Not the existence of God. I don't think he persuaded many people with his proof that God exists. But he did persuade people based on pure logic. I think that is his contribution, and why he has become an unforgettable figure in philosophy is that he uses pure abstract reasoning to derive at an important conclusion, deduction, not an induction, but a deduction that about his own existence.
Why everybody believe him? God exists.
Now, I don't know whether they believe him, but they believe God exists. That's it.
Why everybody believe him?
God. Why everybody believes God?
Mm.
God exists.
Mm.
Okay, so why does everybody believe that Trump is the president of the United States?
Oh, this is a system.
Okay, exactly. The system in that time was 100% everybody.
No,
Bought
everybody don't want to going to be him the president, but it cannot be avoidable. System.
No. But so basically, this is obvious. But that's exactly the same attitude that existed 400 years ago about the existence of God. Yeah, of course God exists. God is. You don't doubt God. Actually, it's very unhealthy to doubt God because you would be killed. But people did not dare to doubt God. Everything they learned from the moment they woke up till they were born till the moment they died, everything pointed in the same direction. God exists.
But I understand what you mean. But why at that time he said God exists?
Why he said? No, he was trying to rebuild. So he was a skeptic, right? So as a skeptic, he did not. What he was looking for was the truth. So, but what truth can you be certain of? So he went back and back and back, and he questioned everything. So he could not prove that the world around him existed. He could not prove even that he was there. He could not prove anything. The only thing that he ended up being able to prove was he was looking for the foundation based on which he could actually build and prove what did exist and what was real. And he strictly used his mind and his analytical skills to deduce his thinking skills. So I think in another video said he was found in bed and he was thinking till 11 in the morning while his friends came by. For him that was work. So he used purely his mind, his abstract ideas, without any observation outside, to derive at certain conclusions. That was new. That form of philosophy, the strict following of your own mind and your own reasoning, is the contribution of Descartes to philosophy as a method. As a method, not as the conclusion, but as a method. I think it was mainly important.
Takashi, could you follow?
難しいっすね。
I can't follow.
難しい。
I don't understand.
かなり難しい。
He's talking about God exists. No, I don't understand why Descartes said God exists at that age, at that time. Roman Empire or Pope existed beforehand, and they said God exists. I understand. But why 16th or 17th century he daily say God exists? Or skeptic? What he's doing?
No, you have to understand. Denying that God exists could get you killed, Uma-san.
Yeah, I know that, but why he says that so? What kind of, asset he just, his heritage is so famous. And I don't understand why so he's famous. Just only he said, skeptic, so what?
No, I think that the way that he arrived at his conclusion, the way that he came to this insight that actually he exists, was a groundbreaking process and gave rise to other people to kind of like ask philosophical questions and come to a conclusion.
Like Plato or Socrates or Nishida Kitaro is compared with Nishida Kitaro is very small compared with his famous name, but I don't think he's what kind of his asset heritage is so heavy. I don't think look like that. Oh, that's it, right?
Descartes, his heritage. So his fame is bigger than his heritage.
Yeah, my feeling. But at that time, he gave a lot of impact for those people at that age. But what is that?
Well, what you saw, the people who influenced him, I wonder whether they were influenced by his conclusions or by his method. And I would say that they were more influenced by his method than from the list that you read. They are all philosophers. They're all professionals in the same field. They are not like others. But for example, the queen or the princess or whoever who corresponded with Descartes.
Queen.
That's good PR, of course. Oh, I had a liter of this Mazui coffee.
You told me you like it.
So I thought I did, but one liter is too much.
I'll show you. Oh, my God. 1643.
1643.
Elizabeth. Princess Elizabeth wrote a letter to him. 1643. You just check it.
1643. Oh.
Yeah. Elizabeth, Princess Elizabeth wrote a letter to him.
Right.
And finally he wrote a book, 1649, the answer for her. And he said, this is not English. The spirits animaux.
Spirit animal. That's a lively spirit. That's French.
Yeah, he just wrote a book. He wrote a book. This is Japanese. So this one is one big discussion, and mind and body is the same. Is she her question, and he just thinking about spirit and body, and then he wrote answer on 1649, and then his answer is spirit animal.
A living spirit. A living spirit.
Something he's just mental, spiritual.
So
this kind of this kind of his thought is influenced to Spinoza, Leibniz.
Spinoza was from the Netherlands.
So 1645, he just wrote something for her. He's something free will and God infinite character is does not exist both, but
that's his conclusion.
No, his also conclusion is something relation both of those. But I don't know, I don't understand. But he wrote a lot of material. What is his, also he's doing something for mathematical.
He was a mathematician. Well, that doesn't surprise me because it requires a very strict abstract reasoning to come to his conclusion.
I'm very interested in
logic.
Yeah, just letter of the Princess Elizabeth, 1643, and he just I don't know what to do. But anyway, today teach.
Today was 辛かった.
It's okay, and very good discussion I did. And Descartes is not easy person.
No. No.
Okay, I give you 1643.
So 1643,
Descartes.
Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Okay.
Elizabeth. 1643, and he wrote a book. Is I don't know in English. He wrote book 1649 for the answer.
1643.
And 1649.
Elizabeth letter Descartes. Yeah. Ah, here.
You find it?
Letters.
Yeah, letters. Yeah. You find it? This must be
Yes.
a famous letter from Elizabeth.
Wrestling with philosophy. How can souls move bodies?
Oh, yes. That's right. So he takes several years to make answer for her. Yes, that's right.
How can souls move in this? Okay. Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia. In the previous post, we got a quick introduction to substance dualism, Cartesian dualism, the idea that the mind, soul, and the body are not one and the same, and therefore fundamentally distinct substances. Right. So mind and body, sound mind and sound body, those are two different things. That is, your brain is not your mind, and your mind is not your brain. Oh, right. So your thoughts live in your brain, but we look at two of the arguments that Descartes gave for the position and some of the objections. Whether we find the arguments convincing or not, most psychological studies show that most people are dualists, but few people are neurologists as well. There are some contemporary arguments for different types of dualism, which we will look at in later posts, but for now we are going to focus on substance dualism. Setting all that aside, supposing we are convinced that dualism is true, it's interesting to consider what the difficulties this position might give rise to. Descartes' contemporary, Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, brought up some of these problems to Descartes himself in their written correspondence. At the heart of the problem with dualism is the interaction problem. How is it that something doesn't have any physical properties? It means that it doesn't exist in space, has no extension and has no mass, can interact causally with something that is physically extended and has mass, and vice versa. So how can something that doesn't exist, doesn't have any physical values like a thought, can move a physical body and vice versa? So how is it that thoughts in the mind, which have absolutely no physical properties, can causally bring about actions in a physical body? Or that something happening to the body, like a stimulation or our perception organs or being poked by a needle, can bring about a perceptual experience and thoughts. I see a red chair, or ouch, that freaking hurts. It would seem that for anything to causally affect a physical body, it too must be physical, or at least have some minimal physical properties like mass and extension. To see how Descartes responds to the interaction problem, let's take a look at the back and forth in the letters between the two and see if he gives a satisfactory response. So first, Descartes' first attempt. The reason it seems that there is an interaction between mind and body is because I haven't explained how they interact yet. The goal of the meditations was only to give the notion of body and soul that explained why they are two distinct substances, not to explain how they interact. But now that you're asking, also
Although I only discuss the notions of body and mind that allow us to distinguish them, it doesn't mean that there aren't additional notions that we can appeal to that explain how the two interact. The confusion arises that you are using the notion that allow us to distinguish between the two to try to explain how the two interact. But this obviously won't work because we're missing the relevant explanatory notions. He then gives Elizabeth an analogy to illustrate his point. The scholastic, the tradition of philosophy that Descartes opposed, believed that there was a thing called heaviness that caused objects to fall to the ground. But they were misunderstanding the notion of heaviness. Yes, having heaviness is why objects fall to the earth. But the scholastic misunderstood heaviness and as a being, actual thing that physically causes the object fall to the ground. They were misapplying concept that this is why they were confused. So heaviness it should be gravity, right? Something along the same lines is happening when we talk about the properties we attribute to our bodies and minds to account for how they interact. We are misconceptualizing and misusing the properties, and this is the cause of our confusion. To summarize, he avoids giving an answer to the interaction problem. So what he's saying is that, yeah, there is a body and a mind, but you say that these two are directly and should directly explain the fact why one influences the other. But there are other things at stake that I did not include. So he doesn't give the answer. Okay, so what is it? All right. So Elizabeth replies. Before I begin, I just want to point out that Elizabeth's writing is a stunning example of the principle of charity. Elizabeth Descartes' initial reply was unconvincing at best and totally sidesteps the problem at worst. But look at how Elizabeth replies. Now, here she starts. Now, the interest of my house, which I must not neglect, now some conversations and social obligations, which I cannot avoid, beat down so heavily on this weak mind with annoyance or boredom that it's rendered useless for anything else at all for a long time afterwards. This will serve, I hope, as an excuse for my stupidity in being unable to comprehend the heaviness example that Descartes gives to explain why the interaction problem isn't really a problem, but simply the result of not having misunderstanding the notions of explaining how interaction occurs. Ah! If only Facebook and YouTube disputes had this much civility. Okay, so on to her reply. In short, she says, even with the heaviness example, I still don't understand how an immaterial thing that doesn't exist in space or have mass or extension can causally interact with a physical thing. I cannot conceive of an immaterial thing as anything but the negation of matter. And in order for matter to move, it must be acted upon by the physical force. And contact, none of which are possible for an immaterial substance to do. So thoughts do not exist, don't have any matter. Therefore, if I don't have any matter, how can I move this table if I don't have any matter? If I'm merely a thought, I cannot move this table. So the only way to move this table would be magic. So how is it possible that my thoughts would be able to move this table? It's impossible. In fact, it would be easier for me to think of the soul as being a material than to conceive of how something non-material could actually interact with something material. Information, always the helpful one. Elizabeth offers Descartes a possible solution. A possibility would be that the soul moves the body by communicating information to it. However, the information can only be interpreted and understood by the body if the body possesses intelligence. And Descartes denies that matter can be intelligent. So, it's not going to work. So, Elizabeth says, okay, well, probably what you mean is the mind moves the body and the body moves matter. But he denies it because the body is not capable of grasping the intentions of the mind because it doesn't have any intelligence. So it cannot transform it. In June 28th, in 1643, Descartes' second reply. In short, Descartes still doesn't offer a direct answer. He says that since it is easier for Her Highness to attribute matter and extension to the soul than to attribute it to the capacity to move a body and to be moved by one without matter, having matter, she should feel free to attribute the matter and extension to the soul. By doing so, she will be able to conceive of the union of the soul and the body, even though in reality they are two separate things. The reply is quite unsatisfactory because, A, if the soul is not extended, as Descartes maintains, how will conceiving it as such explain away the interaction problem? Also, if there are to conceive of the union of body and soul, as Descartes instructs us, presumably this would involve conceiving of some causal connection. That's precisely the thing that Elizabeth is not able to conceive of. Clearly irritated and by the fact that he can't come up with a good answer, Descartes ends his letter by admonishing Elizabeth for being too philosophical. Finally, though, I believe it's very necessary to have understood well once in a life the principles of metaphysics, since it is these that give us the knowledge of God and of our soul. I also believe that it would be very harmful to occupy one's understanding often in meditating on them. So, okay, so she's too philosophical. We should find the truth in the laws of physics and not get lost in the metaphysics. Now we're getting into Facebook fight territory. At this point, I think Descartes would have blocked her.
Long discussion.
So long discussions. Oh, this goes on for a long time. This is
whole book is on this.
But Elizabeth is very smart for a princess. Up until now, Elizabeth was primarily focused on asking how the immaterial mind could casually influence the actions of the material body. Now she asks for a clarification on the other side of the interaction problem. How is it that the passions, body feels like hunger or physical pleasure, can interact with non-material mind to influence our thoughts? Descartes wrote, the passions of the soul, largely as a response to Elizabeth's request for more information on the interaction between the passion and the immaterial mind. First, he lays the groundwork of how to distinguish between things that pertain to the body and things that pertain to the soul and things that pertain to the body. Anything that we can experience as being in us, which we see as existing in wholly inanimate bodies, must be attributed to our body. Okay, so anything that we experience as being in us, which we see as existing in wholly inanimate bodies, must be attributed to our body. Okay, anything that we cannot conceive of as belonging to a body must belong to the soul. Okay. From 2, it follows that thoughts belonging to the soul, from 1, it follows that heat and movement belong to the body. 70C, physiology and anatomy. How the animal spirits, the stuff that how the animal spirits, the stuff that causes bodies to move, cause movement. The animal spirits, tiny particles that the 17C physicians believe to be responsible for animation, are contained in the blood. They are very, very fine particles. The heart pumps them up to the brain, where they enter cavities and go through the pores, thereby coming into contact with the nerves and then the muscles. That's how bodies move. So he comes up with a physiological explanation. How does the body move without the soul? Sometimes the animal spirits can cause some pores to open or close more than others, which in turn causes a muscle to contract more or less. The sensory nerves can cause the pores to be opened more or less than usual, which in turn causes the animal spirits to change direction and go to the muscle. So okay, that goes on. Then the function of the soul. In this mechanistic framework, you may ask, where our soul mind is in all this? The soul is the place where we have our thoughts, of which there are two main kinds: actions of the soul and passions of the soul. Actions of the soul are our volitions, since we experience them as coming from our soul. The passions of our soul are the various perceptions we have, since they are externally caused. So how do body and soul interact? Through the pineal gland in the brain. So how do we know the pineal gland in the brain, seat of the soul? All of the organs of our external senses come in twos: eyes, hands, ears, and so on. Ignore that you only have one tongue and one mouth, 10 fingers, etc. There must be a place where the two images coming in the two eyes or in the double organs of any any other sense converts them from a single image or impression before reaching the soul. Otherwise, the soul would see two of the image. Wow. That's... Okay, so Descartes basically loses it here.
Really?
Completely loses it. So he completely...
but finally he wrote a book.
Yeah, he wrote a book, but the book doesn't make sense at all.
He wrote a book in 1989.
Yeah,
1645.
about the senses, eh?
Yeah, 1645. No, 1645. 89.
The passions of the soul.
Oh, yes.
So basically...
So what he said...
So what he said is that there are senses, and it's pertained in our blood, and through cavities into our brain that blood enters, and that physically... so he comes up with a physiological explanation of why we move. So he loses it. He completely loses it. It's not true. It's incorrect. He's completely defeated by the Queen. He doesn't have the answer.
By Lenin.
So he doesn't.
But
have the answer.
he tried to come back, 1649.
Right. So he tries to come back, write a book, but the book doesn't make sense at all.
Oh really?
Right.
Oh, I'm looking for the kind of something impressive.
Oh.
Okay. Looks like he's good, huh?
So his reputation is bigger than himself, maybe.
Okay. So today is finished?
Yeah.
You tried to ask Takashi something.
Takashi-san, 疲れた?
Okay.
Takashi said something. I am so tired, Still, I am very, opaque and big in my mind. Why Descartes is so respected. I don't understand what Ed said was saying.
Well, I think no, seriously, I think that he is like the representative of a new school in philosophy that is purely that purely philosophizes within the mind, without any observation outside. Doesn't allow for outside observation, but just comes to conclusions and finding truths from within yourself. I think that is the contribution of Descartes.
Yeah, but usually beforehand I just studied Nishida. I so much impressed, right?
Mm.
But Descartes, I don't have nothing impressive. So what? Maybe Takashi, you also tired, right?
Maybe he's offended when he hears you.
Huh?
Descartes. He was well respected.
But unfortunately, I can't spend time for listening. I'm so busy writing lot of things. Okay, now tomorrow I'm going to make a big presentation.
Right.
And next